in heaven. That's what we're going to be thinking about tonight. And this week and next, we'll be looking at the middle chapters of the book of Revelation. And then we'll be finishing the entire book by the end of August. We'll look at chapters 21 and 22, those last 2 weeks of August. And those last chapters give us God's glorious plan to dwell with humans forever. And so we'll spend some time looking at each one of those chapters, 21 and 22. So tonight and next week, we're going to do a broad sweep. We're going to zero in here, and we'll read our passage in a few minutes. But I got to give you some background and some context for all of this. So turning the page from last week, what we get here in the middle chapters of Revelation is really the same story as the first third of the book, but approached from a different angle, an angle with much more detail. And so by now, I hope that we're all on to one of the most important guiding principles for reading this book: how these visions, in this great cascade of visions, work to urge the church on to greater faith. And we keep that original audience in mind, the early church, the first century church, who knew their scriptures well. So all of that is going to come into play again tonight as we take up chapter 12 of the book of Revelation. And those of you who like to read along, now's your time to find it, chapter 12. So let me offer a few more comments while you're finding that. At this point in our journey through the book of Revelation, we left off with chapter 7, remember? And at this point, we've seen 6 of 7 seals opened. The 7th seal is opened in chapter 8, and that seal introduces a further sequence of 7s. This time, it's 7 trumpets. So in Revelation chapters 8 through 11, angels blow these trumpets or horns one by one. And you can think of it as a ram's horn, a shofar. And each one of these angels with the horn announces a new plague of some sort until we get to the center of the book, chapter 12, and that's our reading for tonight. Okay, you follow that? But before we have all these horns blowing and these plagues and all this unleashing of evil, something else must happen first. And I need to tell you about it because it's an important frame here for the very end of the book, where we get that glorious picture of God's new creation. But here in chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8, before these horns are blown, it's so important that the churches hear this message. They need to hear something before the trumpets and the plagues begin. So first, in chapter 8, there's a long, long silence. Half an hour, we're told. Half an hour. Well, what's that precise metric doing in this book with so many visions? Well, I think John wants to impress upon us this moment of importance and just how long it is. And that's why I can't skip over it either. Think about it. Picture it. All the singing and the worship of the earlier chapters stops, and silence falls over the throne room. It's like Act 2 of the drama is about to begin, and so we get a long silence as the curtain rises. There's a sense of awe and expectation. And then this happens. An angel comes and stands before the altar with a golden censer. And a censer, I kind of picture it just like a bowl. It's a censer is a vessel that holds incense. Now, do you remember what we said about incense in God's throne room several chapters back? Yeah, that's right. It was associated with the prayers of God's people. And so it is here. So the angel in chapter 8 is given, quote, a large quantity of incense. And this incense, with the prayers of God's people, rises up before God in his throne room. And there's silence here as if God is taking in the prayers of his people. And then the angel takes the censer, fills it with fire from the altar. Remember what's under the altar, the saints and their cries for justice, filling the throne room of God. Well, the angel takes the censer and fills it with fire from the altar, and then he casts it down upon the earth. And there are great crashes of thunder, and there's lightning, and there's an earthquake. It's very noisy. So do you see it? God's answer to all those prayers, the cries of his people, the cries of his for justice, the cries about evil and suffering, and all that stalks the earth, cries that everything should be set right. Well, God's answer is fire. And fire in the Bible almost always means judgment, purification, the ultimate destruction of evil. And so, hearing the prayers of his people, you see what's happening. God joins his people in their indignation and anguish over evil. The angel throws down the fire. And, Jesus himself said in Luke 10:49, I came to cast fire on the earth. Well, God will vindicate his people. That's the message here. Before all this evil is unleashed, that's what God is saying. I will vindicate my people. And so we have to hear that message first before we go into these middle chapters. Okay, so let's move ahead. We're going to go past all the plagues and the locusts and the fiery riders, and we're here at chapter 12. And in chapter 12, we find visions that reveal the ultimate source of evil. And that's the dragon, the accuser, Satan. I got to talk about this for a moment before we read our passage. The serpent, the devil, the prince of darkness. He goes by all these names in the scriptures. And the Bible is never super precise about who this figure actually is. I mean, we get some glimpses of who he is, his backstory, and tonight is one of those. The Jews knew this figure as a personal source of evil, one who has his own cadre of dark angels. And he both leads humans into personal wickedness, and he causes evil and injustice on a large scale. And Jesus himself warned his followers against the wiles of the evil one and his minions. And yet, and this is very important, the early church believed that Jesus had indeed defeated evil, the evil one. And Paul puts it this way in Colossians 2:15. Jesus, I like this, disarmed the principalities and powers and triumphed over them. Defeat. Jesus has already defeated evil. The eradication of evil is going to come at a later time, but Jesus has won the battle already. Okay, are we ready to read? So let's hear now the word of the Lord as recorded in Revelation 12, verses 7 to 12. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, the one who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives, even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So war breaks out in heaven, and we thought it could not get much worse. Well, what exactly is happening here in chapter 12? Well, let's start what we know from this passage. So first, we learn that Michael's that great angel who stands guard over God's people. That's Daniel 12 tells us that. Michael and his angels fight the dragon and defeat the dragon, and they're able to expel the dragon and his dark angels from God's throne room. And we know who this dragon is from verse 11. We're told that he is the devil or Satan. And that's a word which literally means the accuser, and whom John here calls the deceiver of the whole world. So this old dragon and his contingent of angels is thrown out of heaven, we're told, tossed to the earth. God's throne room rejoices. All in God's throne room rejoice. But the earth and sea are warned, woe to you, because that angry old dragon is loose on the earth. And we're told the dragon is really angry because he knows, verse 12, that his time is short. A war in heaven. God's side wins. And the dragon has a short time to do his dirty work on earth. So that's what we have here. But it's terribly enigmatic, isn't it? I mean, the first question we have is this past? Is it present? Or is it future? How are we supposed to read this? What is God showing us? And more specifically, what is God showing the first century churches as they undergo persecution? We always have to listen for that message. Well, I'm going to make a case here that this passage does not describe the future, but the past and the present. So at the beginning of chapter 12, this is the part we didn't read, we get a description that clearly recalls Genesis 3:15, when we learn that a woman is about to give birth and none other than the old dragon himself attends her birth. So he's waiting, we're told, verse 4, to devour her child. But this is no ordinary child. And of course, the dragon is Satan. We're told that. The child is the promised Messiah. Verse 5 of the chapter says this: she gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule over the nations with a rod of iron. Well, that's a reference to Psalm 2, and specifically verse 9, which talks about the Messiah and the fact that he'll one day come to rule the world with a rod of iron. So all of this seems to be an important angle on Genesis 3:15, which you may recall is that crucial passage that predicts that the woman's offspring, the Messiah, will bruise the serpent's head, even as the serpent bruises her offspring's heel. In other words, Genesis 3:15, the evil one will do his damage, but he will not defeat the Messiah, the offspring of the woman. And so it is. In Revelation 12:5, we're told that the woman's child indeed is not defeated by Satan, but rather her offspring, the Messiah, and I quote, is caught up to God and to his throne. Well, that's what happened, right? When Jesus was taken up to God's throne room at the ascension, right? After the resurrection. And meanwhile, the passage tells us the woman is protected. And, I don't have time to discuss her further. The latter part of the chapter, she comes back into this story. But I read her as signifying that long line of people who believe in the Messiah, like she did, right? In other words, the church. So we get a second vision here. This is our passage. It's the war in heaven that we read about, with Satan being expelled from heaven. And now there are several other references in the New Testament about this expulsion. So we have 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude 6 and Luke 10:18, and they all refer to the original rebellion of Satan. And in Luke 10:18, Jesus specifically tells his disciples, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." There it is. And that's our passage tonight, just echoing that, right? And in verse 8 of our passage, it's quite clear the great dragon is hurled down to the earth. Okay, so all of it an angle on Genesis 3:15 and events around that, we don't know exactly where to place them, but it's happened already. Importantly, though, it's the reaction of the throne room itself that garners the most attention here by our writer, John, and so we have to pay attention to that. We get a most curious phrase in verse 11, and that's what I want to focus on. But let's pick this up in verse 10. I'm going to read it again to you so you get the context. Okay, the devil's thrown down. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their own lives, even unto death." They have conquered him. Did you catch that in verse 11? They have conquered him. The brothers and sisters who've given up their lives. Not Michael and his angels, not God himself, but our brothers and sisters who have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, because they loved not their lives, even unto death. Now, you just think about that. It's a staggering statement. The humans, martyrs, the ones whom Satan accused and cast aspersions upon, it's they who have conquered Satan. And how have they defeated him? By the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives, even unto death. Okay, let's take it apart a little bit. The blood of the Lamb. Well, never would the old dragon have guessed that the Messiah, offspring of the woman, would one day defeat the enemy by the Messiah sacrificing his own life, his blood, right? So Jesus is voluntarily giving up of his own life in a great act of suffering and sacrifice. That would be the turning point in the defeat of Satan. Not seizing power the way that Satan does. That's not what Jesus does. Not backstabbing and manipulation and lying and accusing, what Satan does. But totally the opposite. Sacrificing, even to the point of death. That's what would defeat Satan. And this sacrifice of Christ, the Lamb, would set the pattern. And I really want to underline that here. The sacrifice of Christ, the Lamb, sets the pattern for us. So followers of Christ would tell the story of Christ and stand by Jesus, even giving up their own lives. They would sacrifice, even to the point of death. In fact, we could say believers everywhere would take up their cross, love not their own lives, and stand by Christ. That is what defeats Satan. It's the martyrs first, yes, but it's us too who continue that pattern. Believers everywhere who live a life of sacrifice, of spreading the gospel, of dying to ourselves so that Christ can live in us. So let me just let that sink in for a moment. Doesn't that vivify what Jesus is talking about when he says, "Take up your cross and follow me"? We all must give up our lives, follow Jesus to the point of giving up ourselves for the sake of Jesus. We lay down our self-interests, lay down our comforts, lay down any sense of embarrassment that we might feel in having a spiritual conversation with someone. So many have gone before us and done far more than that. So you and I, we must take up our cross, deny ourselves, and follow Christ to the cross. It means no more complaining about how hard our life is. Have we been murdered for Jesus? No more griping about little stupid things in our life. No more passivity, "I don't feel like it today." We have many brothers and sisters who have gone before us and who are counting on us to follow behind. Follow behind in that life of sacrifice and self-denial, because this is how the kingdom of darkness is defeated. By confessing faith in Christ, by living for him, by dying to ourselves, like the martyrs, our brothers and sisters, have done and continue to do. So every time we give up ourselves, every time we speak against wrong, every time we take a stand with those who are oppressed, who need our help, who are suffering unjustly, every time we do something like that, the kingdom of light pushes back against the kingdom of darkness and his minions. The enemy can't take it when good wins out. It can't take it when justice prevails and love wins. You know, Satan thought he was doing in the kingdom of light when Jesus was nailed to the cross high above the heads of the crowds, bleeding for our sins. Finally, Satan thought he had won. He thought he had mustered the sons and daughters of men against the kingdom of light in one final decisive act. He thought he was going to take over heaven again. But little did the enemy know that God was leveraging his single greatest attribute against the powers of darkness. And what is that attribute? It's God's love, his sacrificial love. So in a profound, deep, and wide act of love and grace, God himself, through the Son, the Lamb, went to the cross on his own free will and gave up his life for us and for his creation. Perfect justice was settled. There was payment for sin. And perfect love won out. It was the greatest act that God could ever do. I mean, he had once rescued his people in another act of love and creativity when he rescued them from the Egyptians, that earthly empire, and he rained down plagues so that they could escape. But this time, God goes even farther. Death on a cross, resurrection from the dead. The devil, the dragon, was thereby defeated. And not only that old dragon had no idea that Christ's followers would have the courage and the power and the love to do the same thing over and over with their lives. They would face torture and persecution in Rome, in Europe from the Goths, in Spain and France during the Middle Ages, and many other places throughout history, and today in North Korea, in Nigeria, Afghanistan, Sudan, India, and many other places. So did you know, let me get a little statistical here tonight, more than 380 million Christians face high level of persecution and discrimination today because of their faith. So that's 1 in 7 Christians worldwide, including 1 in 5 believers persecuted in Africa, 2 in 5 believers in Asia, 1 in 16 in Latin America. So persecution, I mean real persecution. It's not a thing of the past. I mean people losing their homes, losing their livelihoods. This is what I'm talking about. It happens all the time as Christ's people stand up for the faith, even unto death. Well, here's what I want to leave you with tonight. Hebrews 12:1 reminds us that we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. That's how that text puts it, a great cloud of witnesses. And these are the ones who have gone before us, and they encourage us to run the race of the faith. Some have given their lives. All have made the decision that walking the path of Christ is the only way to live. And we learn here tonight in Revelation 12 that the sacrificial denying of oneself is the only way to defeat the kingdom of darkness. So did you get that? The sacrificial denying of ourselves is the only way to defeat the kingdom of darkness. It leverages God's power, the power of his love. And so, dear brothers and sisters, take up your cross and follow Christ. Follow him wherever he leads you. Cry out to God in your suffering and your persecution and your fear and your pain, because your cries are like incense in his throne room. He hears them and he responds, just as he threw fire down, we learned about in chapter 8. So join those who have gone before us in keeping the faith, denying ourselves, and showing grace and kindness and standing up for the good in small ways and big ways. It all counts. Share the gospel. So in doing all these things, and again I say, it's small ways and big ways and small ways. It all matters. Stand against evil. Stand with your brothers and sisters here who have put their lives on the line. In doing all these, we put the dragon on the run. I mean, he's angry now, we learn, because he knows he only has a short time to do his damage on the earth. But his day is coming when his complete eradication will take place. And meanwhile, he is no match for the deep love and mercy and kindness of the Lord our God poured out through us, his priests on earth, as we join Jesus in living lives of radical self-sacrifice. Amen.